Hi there, Graham from Penguin Motors here. Bit of a spoiler alert here. Rusty's made it to the dyno, which means Rusty's been rebuilt. But I'm not going to show any dyno footage quite yet. That'll probably come in the next video. Or maybe the one after if this one gets too long. First, we're going to nip out to the workshop and I'm going to show you removing the oil gallery plugs from the back of the block. A quick snippet of the rear main being machined to take a proper oil seal, and then we'll go on with putting it back together. So, as I've said before, if you're going to really clean the block, ideally you want these plugs out. They're held in from the factory with some super strong Loctite. If you try and do them cold, you'll probably mess up the Hexagon drive, and these plugs are not easy to get hold of. So always heat them up. I'm going to use an acetylene torch, but plenty of time with a blow lamp will do. You don't need to get the block really hot, but if you heat the plug up, it transfers heat and melts the Loctite. Just round and round and round and round, heat the plug up. Yeah, there we go. And that plug, the clean and a bit more Loctite, is perfectly reusable. It is. I've got to say, we've completely and utterly blown the client's budget. So this is a budget restrained rebuild. There's no unnecessary fancy frilly bits on here, but I'm doing what I think is the minimum we need to do to ensure we have a good serviceable engine. So, as we can see, Rusty's actually wearing the registration number of its vehicle. The block itself, the block's been in my Bridgeport milling machine, and I've bored the rear main to take a proper oil seal. It's also been away and it's been rebored to plus 20 pistons, and both faces have had a light skim. Now, I will tell you at some point that there's going to be a few out there going, oh, the block's face has been skimmed and the heads have been skimmed and hydraulic tappets. It's not an issue. It's absolutely not an issue at all. The standard lifters actually have a huge amount of travel range built into them. So providing you don't run out at either end, or if you're too close to travel at either end, the lifter will prematurely run out of travel within its lifespan, because obviously as things wear, the lifter needs to expand, or if, say, the valve's bed deeper, it needs to contract. So the lifter needs to be in a working range. And in fact, if you were going for ultimate performance, you'd probably use an adjustable push rod to put as much preload as possible on the lifter. And what you're doing by doing that is you're reducing the amount of oil in the lifter, and the lifter will more accurately transmit the cam's motion to the valve train. But we're not going anywhere near any of that, so unless I find later on we've got some freakishly long or short valves, or someone's massively cut the valve seats, Lifter preload isn't an issue, and we're not going to have to be messing around with shims. But I will check. Obviously, one thing that's slightly different to norm here is I'm reassembling this in the main workshop. Now, I don't normally do that. I normally reassemble stuff in the engine room. But at the moment, there are so many engines in the engine room, it's not physically possible for me to put this engine together and have a camera, film some of it at the same time. I can't get them that far apart. So I've definitely got a backlog of engines. So at the moment, I'm doing the reassembly or this part of it in the main workshop. Once I'm done, it will go back into the engine assembly room, which is kept permanently heated. Mainly because you don't want any dampness. And dampness is what's done a lot of damage to this. If you're gonna do a DIY rebuild or whatever and clean stuff up, by all means make stuff spotlessly clean, but you've got to lubricate everything, not just the bearings, but the rod beams, the cams, the crank, because whilst surface rust on a crankshaft or a conrod doesn't have any actual performance, if the cleansing next to the engine oil washes that rust off, that rust will end up in the oil pump, in the oil system, going around the engine, and it will do damage. So, you know, for all you DIYers at home, make sure everything is oily, not just the important moving bits. Right, here we have the crank back from being polished. The journals themselves look much nicer and they're smooth and not rusty. Well, they weren't rusty in the first place, the journals. And the crank is cleaner. Now all it's been through at the moment, it's been through parts washer, which is just cleans with really hot water. And actually, the parts washing process has actually cleaned off most of the rust. But if I rub a finger on the crank web, I can still get rust off it. Now the rust isn't going to hurt it, but as I say, this goes to prove what I said earlier, that with all the rust that was on it, if you ran the engine as it was, the heat and the action of the oil thrown around, the detergent in the oil, would have cleaned all that loose rust off, and that would have ended up going up the oil pump. Not good. So all the real loose stuff's gone. All I want to do now is remove some of the lighter stuff, and you can do that. All you need is a Scotch-Brite pad and a bit of WD-40 or similar, or if you haven't got a Scotch-Brite pad, kitchen scourer will do. Simply spray the journals, spray the pad, and give it a scrub. So the crank is ready to reinstall in the block. You notice I've already put the rear maiden seal on after having lubricated the journal. There's no need to do it this way, but my personal preference is drop the crank in the block with the seal already in position. The main bearings have been refitted. They're the ones I took out. There are those that believe you can't reuse a bearing. That's utter nonsense. Provided it's not overly worn and it's still a good fit in the housing, bearings can be reused. They're not one-time use only. And I've even done it on some very high RPM race engines. So, reusing a bearing, provided it's unworn, no issue whatsoever. So we've got some assembly lube in there. All I need to do now is pick the crank up and gently drop it into position. In fact, I will lubricate the thrust face first. With some assembly lube. I know it's abbreviated, but my writing's not good enough to write the whole word. There we go. Main cap's on next.
Bit of oil on the journals. You could lubricate the bearing, doesn't matter which way round. I'm going to leave that one for the moment. You don't need a great deal. The clearance between the bearing and the crankshaft is only 0.02 inch or so thereabouts, so you don't need swathes of oil. And I always like a little bit of thin oil on the main studs to lubricate them, help ease them into the alley block, but you only want a little. If you overdo it, then you'll get an inaccurate torque figure because you'll get a hydraulic lock at the bottom. I'm going to drop the one with the thrust on first, just to make sure it's located, and just a smear of oil on the thrust face. Arrow forward, very hard to get wrong. Just going to run it down by hand. We can talk later. Turns, that's good. So I've put the middle main on because that locates the crank this way. Or should I say fore and aft. I've got our rear main, bearing installed, and crucifixes. And I just like a bit of sealant just there, very thin smear, just to make sure we get sealing. And I put a tiny bit up the crucifix. It doesn't need it, but it makes it slide in a lot easier. So as we said, I've already oiled the journal, but I'm going to be greedy, a little bit more now, right? And we can just, a little bit of wiggling and jiggling. There she goes. Cool. Those crucifix seals are very tight. So just slide the cap down into position. Making sure our seal is still square. And I'm going to snug down the rear main. Right, as they say on some of the American TV programs, talk to spec. So what we're going to do a bearing clearance check with plastic gauge. Now, many an engine has been wrecked because maybe everything's been measured up by various suppliers or the machine shop, but someone simply supplied the wrong size bearing for the crank. Now, one way round the crank won't rotate, but the other way round, if you've got a bigger undersize than the crank is, the crank will work lovely, but you won't have any oil pressure. So, and what bearing clearance is, what plastic gauge is an easy method of checking bearing clearance. Here in the pack, you get some instructions. Don't need them. And what you get is some little waxy strips. Let's just open the packet, see if we can get one out. There we go. A little bit of waxy strip. if you can see that. Difficult for the camera to pick up. But we put our little wax strip on the crank journal. Let's zoom you in a bit. There's our wax strap on the journal. We take our cap, dry. We pop our cap on with the bolts. Release the bolts. So, we can then pull off the bearing, and our thin bit of plastic gauge is now a thick bit of plastic gauge. And an old school rule of thumb is you should have 1/1000th of an inch clearance for every inch of bearing diameter. And these bearings are a little over 2 inches, so we would expect somewhere between 2 and 2.5 of an inch of clearance. And to measure that, we have a scale in metric that side and imperial that side, and we literally offer it up. And the tighter the clearance, the wider the spread of plastic gauge. So there we are, lined up 2/1000 inch, so it's definitely bigger than 1.5, and it's not quite 2.5. It's not quite the full spread of 2. So basically, give or take a fraction, we've got 2/1000th of an inch clearance between the bearing and a journal, which means size-wise, it must be correct. One check that I'm not going to do now that I normally would be end float on the crankshaft, because I did that when I took it to bits. But what you do, you'd lever the crank all one way, and then use a feeler gauge between the crank and the thrust washer to measure the clearance, or with a dial test indicator on the end of the crank, and lever it backwards forward to see the deflection. But I say, I did that when I took it to bits, and it was with intolerance, so seeing as the crank is the same, the bearings are the same, there's no need to recheck. Ring gap, it's good to pop a couple of rings into the bores and check the gaps with the feeler gauge against specified clearance. On these, the manufacturer's tolerance is huge and the ring gaps are big. Don't get too hung up on ring gaps. Small is bad. You do not want small, because under extreme load, heat, the ring gap could close to the point that the ends butt, and if the ends butt up, they break the piston. But a bit big, it's neither here or there. While I'm here, it's worth pointing out the rings do have a right and a wrong way up. This one is marked with top, but sometimes it's just a number or letter. Con rods. The rods themselves had to be blasted in to get rid of the rust, but also they've been resized. Now, I don't think the camera picks it up, but there's a little tag there on a bearing. And a lot of people think that tag is what stops the bearing spinning inside the con rod, but nothing could be further from the truth. So if you were to take the two bearings, put them together and measure across the outside there, that diameter would actually be bigger than the hole in the connecting rod. That crushes the bearing slightly, and that is what stops it spinning in the rod. So it's important that this hole is not only the correct size, but it's round. And over the course of a lot of miles, they tend to stretch and elongate. So they've been resized, which basically means the rod was taken apart. There's a bit carefully ground off the cap, and it bolts, and then they're bolted back together. At that point, is no longer round. And it's slightly undersized in that side. So then, on a honing machine, it's bored back to the correct size, which thus makes it perfectly round and gives the bearing perfect, snug, snap fit in the rod. Right, rings next. Time to fit them. Expander for the oil control goes on first, making sure the two ends don't overlap, and then the rails can go on. Sometimes they're fiddly. You want to avoid the ends of the ring gaps all overlapping, but it's not uber critical. That's oil control rig on. Obviously, now the second compression. Any markings go on the top. And whilst you can buy ring compressors, they're quite easy just to open up. 2 thumbs. Just open up enough to drop them over the piston. Right, there you go. It's in the groove. But the one thing you don't want to do with them, you don't want to kind of put one end on and then wind the ring down, because you can put twist in the ring then. So just open them up. There you go. Pop in. Done. Right, that's it. Rings on. So we've already got a few pistons in. What I would do next is turn the crank pin for the next piston I'm going to fit. So that's at bottom dead centre on that cylinder. And then flip the block round. Now the crank pin at the very bottom, when we go to put the rod in, the rod should stay vertical, and providing we've got the orientation of the piston right, the big end bolts won't hit the crank pin. Bit you didn't see off camera was where I put a bit of a radius around the top of the bore to give the ring an easier time on the lead in. So a little bit of oil in the top. No need to go bad. You really don't need to drown it in oil. A little bit on the rings. And again, there is a school of thought that actually you don't need any lubricant on the rings, but I like a little. It also helps the ring compressor. My preferred compressor is one of these ratchet types. Pop the piston in, snug the ratchet up, don't go mad. You grip it too tight, you'll struggle to get the piston out. I tend to dribble a bit of oil on the crank pin, a little bit on the big end. Now point to note, V8 Rover conrods have an offset, so they need assembled the correct way round. So I'm going to drop the piston in the bore. Tap the top of the ring compressor, and what I'm doing here, I'm making sure the compressor's flush all the way round, because if it's slightly unravelled you can get a gap, and as you knock the piston in, if you're not careful or if you're unlucky, the end of a ring will jump into that gap under the ring compressor and jam it. So this is the bit I don't like doing, never have done. Few firm taps, the piston should drop straight in. And if we've lined it up right, push it down with the fingers, turn the engine over, and we can see straight on the crank pin. I'm just going to turn it a little now, so I can put the rod cap on. bit more oil, and on these, the tags, the cutouts, go on the same side. We'll go back later to retook the big ends, but you notice the rods have got a little nodule there, and when you've got both sets in, they should point to each other. Well, finally for the moment, ring gaps. Any of you know about two-strokes? Two-stroke rings have pegs, and the reason they have pegs is to stop the rings rotating, so that you can't get the end of a ring jammed up in transfer port. But in a four-stroke, there are no such pegs, and in fact the rings are free, in fact do rotate in the engine. So whilst I do avoid the gaps being lined up, I don't put a great deal of effort into making sure they're spaced at exactly 120 degrees apart. In fact, if you're going to space them 180, 180, 180 makes more sense to me. But yeah, there you go. I spaced the gaps out, but don't put a huge effort into making sure they're very exact, because wherever you put them isn't where they'll stay. Right, camshaft next. Real steel Hurricane camshaft, which is the one that came with the engine. Unfortunately, it's in mint condition, having never run. Unfortunately, we lost the audio to this clip, but what I want to do here is verify true TDC. So I've put a timing disc on the crank and a pointer set to approximate TDC. And furthermore, I've put a positive stop above number one cylinder to stop the crank rotating all the way around. And essentially, we need to get it so that when we turn the crank, as far as it will go, it stops at the same number of degrees either side of top dead center. Then we've established where true TDC is. We might need to bend the pointer as appropriate. It's the same this clip. Unfortunately, we lost the audio. So having verified where TDC is, we now put a lifter in and a DTI gauge on number one intake valve. And we rotate the engine until we achieve the maximum possible reading on the gauge. Right. And when we've got that, we know we're right on the nose of the cam. We're just going over the edge, but it's not a very precise point. So what we do, we go backwards slightly and then go forwards and stop just a fraction before our peak lift number. And then take a reading from our protractor. The actual number is slightly irrelevant, but we need to read the number. So let's just, for argument's sake, say we've got a reading of 100. Now, we then continue to rotate the engine forward. The cam will achieve peak lift and then drop back a fraction. And if we keep going till it stops at the same point we took the first reading, we now take a second reading. And we take the two readings together, take the two readings, add them together and divide by 2. And that gives us the middle bit, which is true full lift. So for argument's sake, if we had 100 degrees in the first instance, and in the second instance, we got 120 degrees, then our true full lift would be at 110. And I think in this instance, the cam came timed in at 111, so it's within a degree of where it should have been. So that's it for this episode. In the next one, we're going to pop the heads on, take it round to the dyno, get some oil pressure up, and we might even start it up, make some noise.
Catch you in the next episode, guys.